Right now, as you're watching this, France is shutting down nuclear reactors, not because of a technical failure, not because of an accident, and not because of a fuel shortage. It's shutting them down because the rivers are too warm to cool the plants. 3 EDF reactors were completely shut down this weekend. Golfech on the Garonne River in the southwest of the country. Bugey on the Rhône near Lyon. Chooz on the Meuse on the border with Belgium. 8 others are operating at reduced capacity. This is the 3rd time this has happened since May. What no one is saying out loud is what this means for the 450 million Europeans who depend on this power grid, and what will happen when next summer arrives even hotter than this one. In this video, you'll understand why France, the country that generates 2/3 of all its electricity from nuclear power, is being forced to shut down its own critical infrastructure at the very moment when electricity demand is at its peak. We'll walk through what happened on the Garonne, Rhône, and Meuse rivers, what data from EDF and grid operator RTE reveal about the magnitude of the blackout, how Germany, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom are feeling this impact right now, and why this isn't an isolated event. It's a dress rehearsal for a structural vulnerability that will repeat itself every time a hot summer arrives. No speculation, no dramatization. Just the facts, the science, and what's really at stake. If you live in or have family in France, Germany, Switzerland, or the United Kingdom, tell us in the comments how this crisis is affecting your daily life. Electricity bills, power outages, heat without ventilation. Real stories from people experiencing this right now are what we need to hear most. Subscribe to the channel so the algorithm shows this content to people who need to understand what's happening with the European power grid. And if this video reaches 8,000 likes, it will be updated with next week's data, when the atmospheric block will still be in effect. To understand what's collapsing, you first need to understand what France has built. EDF operates 57 reactors, spread across the country, and together they generate, under normal conditions, between 65% and 75% of all electricity consumed in France. It's one of the largest nuclear fleets in the world, in terms of its share of a country's electricity mix. And this fleet was built in the 1970s and 1980s, when the main engineering question was, where is there enough water to cool the reactors? The answer was France's major rivers. The Rhône, which flows down from the Alps through the Lyon Valley to the Mediterranean, with a powerful average flow, but one that varies drastically between seasons. The Garonne, which crosses the southwest from the Pyrenees to the vast Gironde estuary, passing through Toulouse and Bordeaux. The Meuse, which runs along the border with Belgium in the northeast. The Seine, which flows through Paris. The Loire, the longest river entirely within France. Power plant after power plant was built along the banks of these waterways, with intake and discharge systems designed based on an assumption that is now crumbling, that European rivers, in the summer, would have temperatures between 20 degrees Celsius and 24 degrees Celsius. That assumption was reasonable in 1975. In 2026, it is fiction. Most people who hear that a reactor has been shut down because of the heat imagine that something inside the plant is going to overheat, some risk of a nuclear meltdown. That's not the case at all, and understanding why the reality is both more technical and more concerning than that image is essential for what follows. The problem isn't inside the reactor, it's in the river water even before it enters the plant. The mechanism works as follows. The reactor generates heat to produce steam, which drives turbines that generate electricity. This heat must be continuously removed through a cooling cycle. To do this, the plant draws water from the river. This water passes through a system of heat exchangers to remove excess heat from the reactor's internal circuit, and is then returned to the river at a temperature a few degrees higher than when it was drawn. French and European environmental legislation sets strict limits on the maximum temperature of the returned water, typically between 26 degrees Celsius and 28 degrees Celsius, depending on the river and the specific plant. Because warmer water dramatically reduces dissolved oxygen and kills fish, aquatic invertebrates, and the entire biological chain that depends on that thermal habitat. During a severe heat wave, the river is already naturally warmed to 25 degrees Celsius, 26 degrees Celsius, or 27 degrees Celsius. In this scenario, the laws of physics prevent normal operation. The plant cannot draw in water that is cold enough to cool the reactor and still return it within the legal temperature limit. There are only two options: either operate at reduced capacity, generating less electricity and producing less heat to be removed, or shut down completely. This is exactly what EDF has been forced to do in recent days at 3 of its largest plants. An operations engineer who has worked at one of the Rhone River plants for more than 15 years, and who asked not to be identified because he is not authorized to speak to the press without institutional approval, described the situation with a precision that EDF's official statements could never match. The river temperature readings we received on Sunday morning already indicated that there would be no leeway whatsoever by the afternoon. We knew before noon that the shutdown was inevitable. But what worries me most isn't this particular plant right now. It's that we're seeing this critical temperature window occur earlier and earlier in the season and last longer and longer than in previous years. What used to be a late July occurrence now begins in June, and that's putting us in a situation for which the system wasn't designed. EDF data reported to RTE confirms the scale of what happened. The cumulative loss of nuclear capacity during this heat wave reached 6.4 gigawatts, equivalent to 14% of the generation load on a typical Monday morning. In concrete terms, 3 reactors were completely shut down: Golfech on the Garonne, Bugey on the Rhone, and Chooz on the Meuse, plus 8 operating at reduced power, including Saint-Alban and Nogent-sur-Seine. To put this into perspective, the Itaipu hydroelectric plant, one of the largest in the world, has an installed capacity of 14 gigawatts. What France lost in just a few days of heat represents nearly half of the entire capacity of Itaipu, and that figure spilled out from the power plant's control panels and onto the streets. At one point during the June crisis, up to 106,000 customers on the French grid were simultaneously without power, families without ventilation in apartments in Paris and Lyon, hospitals that activated diesel generators, and elderly people on upper floors of buildings without air conditioning, trying to survive nights of 28 degrees Celsius when the sun barely sets completely. The institutional response that best reveals the depth of the crisis was not the blackout itself. It was what came afterward. On the afternoon of Saturday, July 12, France's Ministry of the Economy issued an emergency exemption specifically for the Bugey reactor, authorizing the plant to discharge water into the Rhone at temperatures exceeding legal environmental limits until July 20. The official justification: to ensure the safety of the power grid. In other words, the government decided that preserving the Rhone's river ecosystem was less urgent than preventing blackouts across the European grid. It's the same impossible choice that 2003, 2022, and 2023 also forced upon us. The difference is that 2026 is forcing it for the second time in a single summer, and that has never happened before. While France struggled to balance ecology and electricity, the contrast with Sweden offers a deeply unsettling lesson. Sweden operates 10 nuclear reactors at the Forsmark, Ringhals, and Oskarshamn complexes, all located on the coast of the Baltic Sea or the North Sea. This choice was no accident. It was a deliberate policy, underpinned by a long-term risk assessment that France dismissed in favor of proximity to inland population centers. Seawater is structurally cooler than water from inland rivers in the summer. It is not subject to the same legal discharge limits as freshwater in river ecosystems. And it does not experience the same temperature spikes during land-based heat waves, because ocean masses have much greater thermal inertia than rivers. Energimyndigheten, the Swedish energy agency, has never been forced to issue an emergency exemption to shut down reactors due to river temperatures, even though Scandinavia broke heat records in 2018, 2019, and 2021. Not because Sweden does not experience heat waves, but because the system's architecture was built with a climate safety margin that French planners in the 1970s simply did not include in their designs, and that omission now comes at a cost, measured in lost gigawatts every time the thermometer rises above 40 degrees Celsius. The difference between Forsmark and Bugey isn't nuclear technology. It's the water temperature 3 kilometers away from the plant. And that was a human choice, made decades before any climate model predicted what 2026 would be like. The difference between Sweden and France in this regard isn't luck. It isn't the intensity of the phenomenon, it's what humans decided to build, where they decided to build it, and with what safety margin they decided to operate when the climate was different. The problem doesn't stop at France's borders, and understanding the continental scale of this collapse is crucial. Under normal summer conditions, France exports between 10 and 12 gigawatts of electricity per hour to its neighbors, a steady stream of cheap nuclear power that keeps wholesale prices relatively stable in Germany, Belgium, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. It is a dependency that has been built up over decades and rarely makes the news, until the day it disappears. During the peak of this heat wave, French exports plummeted from 10 to 12 gigawatts to just 3 gigawatts, a reduction of more than 70% in a matter of days. Neighboring countries found themselves without this cheap supply at the very moment when demand for air conditioning in their own territories was skyrocketing due to the same heat that was shutting down French reactors. In Germany, which shut down its last nuclear reactor in 2023, the impact was immediate and measurable. With the French fleet reduced and domestic demand surging, air conditioning that Germany historically did not need was now being turned on in apartments that were never designed to have it. The German grid had to rely on gas-fired power plants, which are the most expensive and emit the most CO2. Wholesale electricity prices in France and Germany reached their highest levels since early 2025 on Tuesday of the first week of the crisis. An exclusive analysis published by Euronews estimated that in the week of June 21 to 27 alone, electricity prices rose by approximately 371 million euros in Germany and 360 million euros in France compared to the previous week. More than 730 million euros in 7 days for the two countries combined. In Belgium, spot market rates reached more than 10 times the European average in a single night. For consumers with market-indexed contracts, this isn't just an abstract concept. It's their monthly electricity bill. In Switzerland, the Besnau nuclear power plant, located on the banks of the Aare River near Aarau, faced structural vulnerabilities identical to those of the French plants, confirming that the problem is not unique to France, but rather a systemic weakness of any continental reactor that relies on fresh water from rivers. With French exports reduced, Swiss operators activated emergency reserves. In the United Kingdom, connected to the continent via the IFA2 and ELEC link cables, national grid operators issued grid alerts for the first time this summer, relying more heavily on gas-fired power plants and emergency reserves to offset the drop in French exports. In Poland and the Baltic states, the impact was indirect but noticeable, with wholesale prices rising across the interconnected grid, a domino effect that no national border can contain because electricity flows through the grid without a passport. To understand why this problem will recur and worsen, it is necessary to understand the atmospheric mechanism behind the heat wave. The ECMWF, the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts, confirmed that June 2026 was the hottest June on record for Western Europe, with an average temperature of 20.74 degrees Celsius, 3.06 degrees Celsius above the 1991 to 2020 baseline. Samantha Burgess, the ECMWF's Strategic Director for Climate, explicitly warned of increasingly intense heat waves, a persistently warm ocean, and growing risks to people, ecosystems, and infrastructure. The specific mechanism behind this heat wave is the omega block, a stationary high-pressure pattern that forms when the jet stream, the band of high-altitude winds that normally pushes weather systems from west to east across Europe, curves around a high-pressure center like the Greek letter omega. When this happens, the high-pressure system becomes locked in place for days or weeks, with normal winds unable to dislodge it. Dry heat, constant sunshine, no frontal disturbances, and no relief in sight. The Mediterranean and the North Atlantic, with surface temperatures above the historical average for July, provide the moisture that fuels and sustains this block for longer than would be possible in a cooler climate. Most people think that a high temperature is just a high temperature, but what really kills during prolonged heat waves isn't the number on a standard thermometer, it's the wet bulb temperature, the measure that combines heat and humidity and represents how effectively the human body can cool itself through sweat evaporation. When the wet bulb temperature exceeds 35 degrees Celsius, the body simply cannot cool itself, even at complete rest, even with ventilation. Europe, in its physical and cultural architecture, was not built for this scenario. In France, the figure is around 25%, concentrated in the southern regions. In the Netherlands, Belgium, and the Scandinavian countries, residential air conditioning was considered an unnecessary luxury in a context of a historically temperate climate. And the nights that were supposed to be a period of thermal recovery are no longer cool, tropical nights, with temperatures above 20 degrees Celsius throughout the early morning, are becoming the norm in Paris, Lyon, Frankfurt, and Amsterdam. Without nighttime cooling, the body accumulates heat day after day, and death does not require temperatures of 47 degrees Celsius to occur. It can set in after 6 nights of 28 degrees Celsius without any cooling. And this is where the story gets really complicated, because the heat wave isn't the event itself. It's the trigger for a chain of events that stretches over months. The first set of consequences is the most visible: deaths from hyperthermia, overwhelmed hospitals, and emergency workers who must respond to the very same heat that is killing the patients they're treating. The June 2026 heat wave has already caused at least 1,300 excess deaths across Europe. But this figure is always underestimated at first. The experience of 2003, when the heat killed more than 70,000 Europeans in a single summer, and governments took months to account for the true extent of the toll, suggests that revisions are usually significantly upward. But that is not the end of the chain. The second set of consequences involves the interaction between the energy crisis and healthcare systems. European hospitals rely on electricity to maintain refrigeration for medications, vaccines, intensive care units, and operating rooms. With wholesale prices reaching historic highs, healthcare facilities' operating costs are skyrocketing at the very moment when demand for emergency care is at its peak. It's a vicious cycle: more patients, less capacity to respond, higher costs, and fewer resources available for redistribution. The July 2026 heat wave hits Europe at the critical moment of wheat, corn, and sunflower maturation in southern France, the Italian Po Valley, and Spanish Andalusia. When temperatures exceed 35 degrees Celsius during the pollination and grain formation period, yields drop by 30%, 40%, or 50%, depending on the crop and the duration of the event. The lost harvest doesn't just affect farmers. It impacts prices in supermarkets across Europe, which is still recovering from the inflation spikes of 2022 and 2023. Vulnerable populations, low-income workers, families with children in lower-income countries are the first to feel the pinch of rising food prices. And there is a fourth set of consequences that is almost never discussed: the link between summer drought and fall floods. Soil that has spent months parched by the heat wave, compacted, with dead surface biomass, and its absorption structure destroyed, behaves like asphalt when the first heavy rains arrive. The water does not penetrate the soil. It runs off directly into the rivers, and rivers whose levels had been reduced by the drought are prone to rapid and violent flooding when the first weather fronts arrive in September and October. The same Europe that is burning now will be flooding in 3 months, due to the same underlying causes. What concrete action can you take today? If you're in France, Germany, Switzerland, or the United Kingdom, identify the coolest spot in your home right now: the basement, the cellar, or the stairwell. That's your refuge during the peak heat between 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. Make sure someone checks in on elderly neighbors today, not tomorrow. Most heat-related deaths in European cities occur among elderly people who live alone and don't ask for help because they don't want to be a bother. A 10-minute visit can save a life. Download your country's weather service app: Météo France if you're in France, the DWD if you're in Germany, the Met Office if you're in the United Kingdom, and enable heat alerts. Don't rely on social media to find out when the alert level rises. I'll be monitoring temperature data for the Rhône and Garonne rivers over the next 48 hours. The emergency exemption that the French Ministry of the Economy granted to the Bugey reactor expires on July 20th, and the central question is whether the Omega block will dissipate before then, or whether France will have to make an even tougher decision about what to prioritize. Once the ECOMWF models provide clarity on this, I'll be back with an update. This community's response has been genuinely moving to witness. In the comments on recent videos, people from Lyon, Frankfurt, Amsterdam, and Lisbon are sharing what they're going through during this crisis, and these stories are what make this work meaningful. Share this video with someone in the affected regions, not just as abstract information, but because understanding what's happening to the European power grid might help them make better decisions in the coming hours. Take care of yourselves. Drink water before you get thirsty. Stay in the shade whenever you can. And see you in the next one.